Russian leader Vladimir Putin made the biggest mistake of his political career by starting a war in Ukraine. Putin's country has now completely turned into a fireplace due to the war in Ukraine. Unbelievable attacks, explosions, and interesting situations of unknown origin are experienced in Russian cities close to the Ukrainian borderline and in all the regions located in the depths or central parts of Russia. In recent days, much more activity has been observed in Russian cities close to the borderlines between Ukraine and Russia. These cities include Kursk, Belgorod, and Bryansk. Surprise explosions that took place in the same city in the past days brought Bryansk to the forefront of these three Russian cities. Let's witness the mysterious and striking explosions that took place in the city of Bryansk. Loud explosions were heard at a military airport in the Bryansk region. According to authorities, the airport was attacked by unidentified drones in the N-124 transport aircraft, which was decommissioned as a result of the explosion, and other elements were severely damaged. However, there is no official information about the full-scale state of emergency in the city yet. The inhabitants of the city were now fed up with such negative situations, and most of the citizens here had left the city. Worrying situations continued to occur in Bryansk, where the tension was at its peak due to the effects of the striking explosions. In addition to the explosions at the city's airport, a freight train derailed in another massive explosion in the Bryansk region. This striking act of sabotage resulted in a terrible fire. Russian Railways press service reported that a locomotive and 7 wagons of a freight train were derailed in the explosion. The train consisted of 60 wagons. In total, 2 tanks were filled with kerosene to avoid possible risks. Russian authorities suspended train traffic in the Un-Ekar-Asaka section. The Russian railway company described the cause of the explosion as the interference of unauthorized persons in the railway transport business. Extraordinary security measures were taken in the region after the dramatic situation in Bryansk. Rail assault groups continued to issue instructions on sabotage on the railway in the Russian Federation. The Russian authorities had taken extraordinary security measures to prevent another possible sabotage action, but Bryansk was still in a dangerous position as the anti-war sabotage groups and partisans in Ukraine were in large numbers. Only one day after the last explosion in the city, what was accepted came true, and another critical situation occurred near Bryansk in Russia. 20 cars of a freight train derailed due to the collapse of the railway line. This explosion was the second state of emergency to occur on Russian railways in the region in just 2 days. The train, which was going downhill when the rail was blown up, was carrying dangerous chemicals. It was claimed that the chemicals carried by the train were propane, sulfur, saltpeter, and lime. Although there was no fire, the Russian Emergencies Ministry was trying to cool the derailed wagons and spills. According to local media reports, the city of Bryansk had almost drawn a black curse on itself. The explosions were incessant. Russian leader Vladimir Putin and many Russian local officials could not understand these explosions. This explosion news was remarkably commented by some Russian mill bloggers. According to the allegations made, the Ukrainian forces had secretly smuggled agents into Russia and concentrated on sabotage action from the first days of May. These allegations could not be officially confirmed, but the city of Bryansk was described as a critical zone after all these explosions. But all these measures could not prevent the explosions in the city. Russian leader Vladimir Putin could not remove the curse placed on Bryansk, and even no Russian local official could prevent such mysterious and gigantic explosions in the city. Did the Ukrainian armed forces begin their big counterattack plans with cross-border operations using partisan sabotage groups? These explosions that took place in the Russian city of Bryansk were not limited to the city. This time, the address of tension was St. Petersburg, the city where Putin was born. Explosions occurred in a military airspace area in St. Petersburg. These striking explosions, which occurred near the airport in the southern suburbs of the city, were also felt in the settlement of Kirovskaya Slavyanka in the Gatchina district. Possible causes for the explosion are thought to be negativities at the nearby Pushkin military airfield, which is used by the National Guard and other Russian military structures. Moscow media announced that the Russian police, the National Guard, and the Ministry of Emergencies controlled the airspace, but no significant evidence was found. At the explosion site, the head of the Pushkinsky district refused to comment on the incident and advised media representatives to contact the press service. This incredible series of explosions in Russia infuriated Russian leader Vladimir Putin, according to some important intelligence reports. Putin will put the Russian Air Force on the stage in response to these stunning explosions in Russia. Since Putin's retaliatory plans are notorious, the possibility that the Russian Air Force will become much more active on Putin's orders should be considered. The Russian Air Force may have performed poorly at the start of the war in Ukraine, but intelligence leaks last month showed the United States was nervous about the prospect of Vladimir Putin returning to the sky to change what's going on the ground. The Pentagon document revealed that missiles for the Soviet-era S-300 and Buk air defense medium to long-range systems, which Ukraine relied on early to target aircraft, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles, could be completely exhausted by this month. Ukrainian air defense has been weakened by Moscow's constant attacks on infrastructure, with cruise missiles launched from Russian soil and Iranian-made kamikaze drones. In contrast, Putin may have shelved the assets of his country's air force, but the Russian Air Force is still seen as the second largest military power in the world. And the Russian Air Force includes about 900 fighter jets and 120 bombers. These figures represent a significant risk that must be kept ahead of the widely anticipated Ukrainian counteroffensive. If the McCoy and MiG-35, Sukhoi Su-35, and Sukhoi Su-57 in the Russian army include large Ukrainian tanks and armored personnel vehicles that do not have sufficient air coverage, a possible future counter-offensive by Kiev may be hampered. Pentagon officials have suggested that urgent measures are needed, especially if Russian planes become more free to attack ground troop positions and important artillery targets. Mark Kansian, senior advisor to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, noted that Ukraine can defend its military forces with the remaining air defense, but not its cities or infrastructure. Kansian stressed that Russia has so far avoided risk in the air and therefore does not expect the Russian Air Force to hover over the Ukrainian skies anytime soon. In the long run, if the Ukrainians do not have more air defense assets, then they can gradually use the air superiority of the Russians. However, it will take a long time before the fighter jets and UAVs of the Russian Air Force can fly comfortably over Ukraine, and the Russians don't have that many cruise missiles. Therefore, the realization of the menacing aims of the Russians seems a little difficult. On the other hand, the Ukrainian army continues to make serious breakthroughs in air defense systems. The Biden administration announced in April that it would send additional air defense interceptors and munitions to Ukraine as part of a $2.6 billion aid package, some of which will aid Kiev's counterattack preparations. As part of this U.S.-provided package, Ukraine will receive 4 Patriot batteries. The $4 million price tag each missile carries makes them suitable for defense against the cheap drones that are wreaking havoc on Ukrainian cities. In short, all these efforts of Russian leader Vladimir Putin seem to be ineffective, thanks to air defense systems and other military aid packages sent to the Ukrainian army. A lot of changes happened in the east. Here the Russians have been struggling to develop their offensive operation around solidarity because the Ukrainians created several lines of formidable defense lines. However, recently the Russians made a very important breakthrough that puts the Ukrainians in Bakhmut in a significant danger. In order to avoid it, the Ukrainians should start preparing for retreat already today. As you remember, after establishing full control over Solder about 2 weeks ago, the front line did not collapse, giving the Ukrainians a lot of time to adjust and regroup. The reason why the Russians could not rapidly expand westward and take Bakhmut and Siversk into pockets is simple. The Ukrainians prepared two defense lines right next to Solder. The first defense line goes along the highway. The southern part of this highway goes along the village of Blahodatn, which turned out to be very convenient because the Ukrainians had to just fortify this village. The northern part of this highway goes along the hill, which is also very convenient, as the Ukrainians have prepared an extensive system of trenches on the high ground. What is more, there is a small river that separates Russian and Ukrainian positions and creates an additional natural barrier. This means that in order to move westward, the Russians need to cross the river and the highway and attack fortified positions on the highlands. This is not an easy task, which is why Russian progress here was extremely slow. On top of that, even if the Russians breach it, there is a second defense line along the top of the hill. And if you look at the topographic map, we can see that the difference in elevation of the Ukrainian second defense line and Russian positions is around 100 meters, which is substantial. That is why the Russians recently decided not to take it in front, but to try moving around it and attacking Mykolaiivka and Vasylkivka. This way they will move around the hill and, if successful, reduce the supply and support of the defenders on the hill. So far, the advances in this region did not bring the Russians any success. There is still plenty of obstacles, such as the local rivers as well as minor Ukrainian fortifications. So the Ukrainian group in Siversk is still relatively safe. Nonetheless, the Russians did manage to collapse the southern part of the first defense line and endangered the Ukrainians in Bakhmut even more. Wagner troops recently released a photo that showed that they established control over Blahodatn. Unlike the trenches to the north, Blahodatn is located in the lowlands, which made the job of the attackers easier. Now, taking control of Dotnet does not mean that the Russians have already cut off Ukrainian supplies, but it does make defending the northern part of Bakhmut significantly harder. As you remember, the Russians have been storming across the Rhine-Breskovska for about 2 weeks. The Russians could only use 2 axes of advance from the east and from the south. Ukrainian military officers reported that the situation had been difficult but stable. And they were right because the Russians did not enter these settlements. However, now the Russians can also attack them from the north. If the Russians manage to enter even the first northern street, the Ukrainians would need to retreat from Krasnohorivka. As you can see, otherwise the Russians would be shooting them in the back. So the Ukrainians have fewer and fewer defensive positions to the north of Bakhmut, which means that the Ukrainians in Bakhmut have to start leaving this town. In my estimation, the Ukrainians have around 2 weeks to safely withdraw, and after that it will become increasingly harder to retreat in an organized way because an unorganized retreat is very dangerous and may cause a very rapid collapse of the front line. Ukrainian command understands this, and they have already prepared many fallback positions inside the city. The preparations started around 2 months ago when the Russians were throwing everything at Bakhmut. They had these fallback positions will come in handy because they will allow to gradually retreat with as low losses as possible, while the losses of the attackers may even spike if they continue to push because they will be attacking relatively fresh fortifications. Overall, the situation around Bakhmut continues to deteriorate. If the Ukrainians manage to continue holding their defense to the north and south of Bakhmut tightly, then the Ukrainians inside Bakhmut can retreat with minimal losses and establish a new defense line in front of Classifier. If the Russians manage to make a breakthrough or the Ukrainian defense line gives in, then the Ukrainians may pay a very high price for not withdrawing timely. Vladimir Putin doesn't know what to do, that Russian forces on Ukrainian territory have begun to disintegrate in a panic. The Kremlin accused the founder of the Wagner mercenary company, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the Russian defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, and the Russian chief of staff, Valery Gerasimov of treason. Russian soldiers and Wagner soldiers on Ukrainian territory clashed. Vladimir Putin, who began his invasion of Ukraine on February 24 last year, could not have imagined that the war would last so long. Although the Russian people criticized Vladimir Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, Putin does not seem to care about the opinions of his own people. With the war lasting so long, the Russian army in Ukrainian territory started to suffer a lot of casualties. Russian forces have also lost a lot of military equipment. Experts say that more than half of the Russian army inventory has been exhausted so far. Putin, who has also lost a lot of soldiers, is sending Wagner mercenaries to the places where Russian soldiers are insufficient in Ukrainian territory. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the founder of the Wagner mercenary company, has sent all of the Wagner soldiers to Ukrainian territory due to their friendship with Vladimir Putin. However, due to the unfavorable conditions created by the war, Wagner soldiers and Russian soldiers started to disagree after a while. In recent months, the Ukrainian army was forced to retreat from this region due to the attacks of Wagner soldiers on the town of Salata. Then the Wagner soldiers captured the town of Salata. Yevgeny Prigozhin puffed out his chest and was proud of the success of the Wagner soldiers. The same cannot be said for Vladimir Putin. After the capture of Soledar, the Russian leader addressed the Russian people. Putin said that Soledar was captured by the Russian army and Chechen soldiers, but he did not mention the Wagner soldiers in his speech. Putin's failure to mention the Wagner soldiers angered Yevgeny Prigozhin. Making a video statement from the Soledar front, Prigozhin stated that it was Wagner soldiers, not the Russian army, who captured the city of Salvador, and that most of the soldiers in Soledar belonged to the Wagner mercenary company. However, Prigozhin's statements infuriated Valery Gerasimov, the Russian chief of staff, and Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister. This led to a major tension between Prigozhin and the Kremlin. Yevgeny Prigozhin accused Defense Minister Shoigu and Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov of vandalizing Wagner in the city of Bakhmut, where the fighting is intense. The Russian army and the Wagner soldiers are still attacking the Ukrainian army. However, Yevgeny Prigozhin stated that the Wagner soldiers fighting for Russia in the city of Bakhmut were not provided with ammunition and military equipment, but all assistance was given to Russian and Chechen soldiers, stating that Russian commanders betrayed them. Prigozhin said that although there were many weapons and ammunition in the ammunition depots, Russian commanders did not share these ammunition with Wagner soldiers. After all these statements, Prigozhin, who wanted to teach Vladimir Putin a lesson, decided to stop the attacks of the Wagner soldiers on the Bakhmut front against the Ukrainian army. Prigozhin, who withdrew his troops on the Bakhmut front to the headquarters, wants to put the Russian army in a difficult situation. However, Prigozhin's decision caused a big fight between the Russian troop commanders and Wagner soldiers forced to fight alone in Bakhmut. Russian soldiers were subjected to an offensive by the Ukrainian army late last night. Then Ukrainian forces realized that the number of Russian soldiers on the Bakhmut front was decreasing. They wanted to turn this into an opportunity and launched a large-scale military operation against the Russian army. As a result of the Ukrainian army's offensive, the Russian troops were forced to leave their positions and retreat from the front line, retreating 7 kilometers further back from the Bakhmut border. The unit's commander of the Russian army fighting against the Ukrainian army requested support from the Russian troops in Soledar. The Russian commander in Soledar asked the Wagner soldiers who had retreated from Bakhmut and returned to Soledar to go back to Bakhmut. However, the Wagner soldiers ignored these orders of the Russian commander and refused to go to Bakhmut. However, the Wagner soldiers ignored these orders of the Russian commander and refused to go to Bakhmut as the Wagner soldiers defied the Russian commander. A big argument broke out inside the headquarters. The Russian commander marched on Wagner soldiers and wanted to arrest Wagner soldiers for disobeying orders. A big fight started when Wagner soldiers marched on the Russian commander, seeing that their commander was in a difficult situation. the Russian soldiers began to attack Wagner soldiers. A big fight broke out between Wagner and Russian soldiers inside the headquarters. The soldiers punched each other for minutes, almost killing each other. However, the fight was ended by the intervention of a different Russian commander in the headquarters. The prolongation of the war has badly affected the psychology of Russian soldiers serving in Ukraine. None of the Russian soldiers who went to Ukraine to fight did not expect the war to last so long. But it is not only Russian soldiers who have been affected by the war. The Russian people have also been badly affected. But the start of the war, the sanctions and embargoes imposed on Russia by the US and Western countries have been very troublesome for the Russian people. Russian citizens who did not feel the impact of sanctions and embargoes in the first months of the war started to feel the impact of these sanctions. Towards the middle of the war, increasing inflation and deteriorating economy in Russia started to make Russian citizens uneasy. Price increases in food and technological products are bothering the Russian people. Russian citizens whose social lives are badly affected now want this war to end. People who want the Russian army to withdraw from Ukrainian territory often take to the streets and organize protests against Vladimir Putin and the war. Even wealthy people living in Russia have been badly affected by this war. Even Russian oligarchs close to Vladimir Putin are trying to get citizenship from different countries, knowing that Putin and his supporters will be tried in international criminal courts after the end of the war. Russian oligarchs are leaving Russia by getting citizenship from different countries. They know that if they do not leave, Putin will demand their support. The vast majority of Russian oligarchs who do not want to support Vladimir Putin have fled the borders of Russia. Another reason for the flight of Russian oligarchs is the death of Russian oligarchs since the beginning of the war. The Russian oligarchs who started to die before the war started have also made other oligarchs living in Russia very uneasy. From a few months before the war until now, nearly 10 oligarchs have been found dead in Russia. All of these murdered oligarchs were anti-Vladimir Putin. In addition, the vast majority of these oligarchs were the owners of natural gas reserves in Russia. With the murder of these oligarchs, Vladimir Putin has now full control of natural gas in Russia. By controlling natural gas himself, Vladimir Putin can constantly threaten Western countries with natural gas. Putin, who often cuts off the flow of natural gas to Europe due to Western countries' support for Ukraine, uses its energy reserves as a weapon. For this reason, Russian oligarchs who want to survive are trying to get out of Russia. The majority of Russian oligarchs and Russian citizens go to Turkey because of the easy acquisition of citizenship in Turkey. They can easily buy citizenship in Turkey. Opposition officials in Turkey are very complaining about the situation. Turkish opposition officials are reacting to Russian oligarchs becoming Turkish citizens by buying a house worth $250,000–400,000 in Turkey. After the Russian army invaded Ukraine, the US and European countries started to seize Russian oligarchs, vehicles such as airplanes and yachts, knowing that their assets will be confiscated in European countries. Russian oligarchs prefer to settle in Turkey for this reason.